I see you coming in, and hello from Finland. Oh, wow. Welcome. Before we get started, we want to thank our partners at Microsoft for making this webinar possible, and it's free to our members. So thank you so much for webinar for Microsoft, and thank you for our members at TAC Network, our partners at TAC Network. I'm going to show you how you can engage, so I can move out of the way on the next slide. You all know that you are mute, so we would love if you would put your questions in the Q&A. If you can go to, yes, put the questions in the Q&A, and you can also put them in the chat. There's plenty of team members here to answer your questions. This is being recorded, so you're going to get the recording and the slides probably in a couple of days. And if you want to ask a question, like be unmuted, just use the raise your hand option and make sure your name is displayed. After the live session, we would love your feedback. So there's just gonna be a short survey. We're gonna be popping it in the chat later on at the end of this session, but we would love your feedback to let us know how we can serve you better. I'm gonna move out of the way and turn this over to our partners at TapNote. You guys have a great webinar. Thank you for being here.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much, Aretha. My name is Ryan Harrington, and I'm with Tech Impact, and we're so excited to be here with you today. If you weren't here for the first webinar, we'll do a little bit of catch up on some of the takeaways from that, but also we'll reintroduce ourselves just in case. So Tech Impact is a nonprofit that serves other nonprofits around the US and beyond. We want to make sure that you are able to use technology to advance your social impact as best as you possibly can. We do that in a lot of different ways, but really relevant for here today is, of course, we love building out educational resources and webinars and partnering with TechSoup to do that. But also our team is a team of builders and developers, and we help actually implement and make some of these things possible beyond that as well. Like I said, I am Ryan Harrington. I lead our data lab team very specifically. So our team is really focused in on how do you use data to make the world a better place? How do you use data to advance your social impact? And we spend a lot of time thinking about data strategy and what that means for you all to be able to advance your missions and really get the most bang for your buck. Data is an optimization tool. It lets you make decisions more effectively. It's a really, really powerful tool in your tool chest. And I'm here joined by Dharneesh and Matt. I'll let them super briefly introduce themselves. So Dharneesh, go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, everyone. I'm Dharneesh Jayaprakash, and I'm the lead data engineer at the Data Lab. I specialize in designing and developing data infrastructure that powers like business intelligence and machine learning applications. I'll pass it over to Matt.
Sure. My name is Matt St. Cyr. I'm an application developer manager at Tech Impact. Prior to Tech Impact, I worked for Microsoft for 12 years. I deal with all things Microsoft and CRM and data analysis and everything under the sun related to data.
Awesome. Thank you to the two of you. You'll get the chance to see Dharneesh and Matt back again a little bit later. I'll be doing most of the presenting about the topics today, and then Dharneesh and Matt are going to help lead us through some really helpful demos, just talking through some of the specific technologies that we're going to be talking about today and how that might be relevant for your organization. Specifically today, we'll be looking through the lens of donor-related tasks, just because that's something that is true for so many nonprofits, things that you have to handle. So thinking forward to what today's agenda looks like, I'll think backwards first. So in the first part of this series, we really focused in on what's actually possible. We wanted to get an understanding of, through the lens of data, what are the types of analyses, and all the way from just like simple descriptive analytics, getting a handle on the past and the present, all the way to more advanced predictive types of analytics, trying to get a handle on the future. And of course, spend some time talking about generative AI besides that. But if you're putting together a great data strategy, you need to have a good understanding of the data lifecycle, the technology that actually enables that. And I think really importantly is, how do you think about governance across all of those things? It's frankly kind of the unsexy stuff in a lot of ways, but it makes it so important. It's like taking your vitamin every day. Having great data governance is what's going to allow your organization to thrive from a data perspective, and certainly all the technology that underlines it besides that. So we're really going to spend our time on some of these topics over the course of today. I want to just recap really quick how we were thinking about data strategy. This is really what we left off with last time, but it's worth just going back to it really quickly and talking about what we covered from here and the other pieces that your teams might need to think about. There's a lot of different ways that you could think about building a strategy, but this is how our team thinks about it. And of course, everything starts off by defining goals and making sure that you have a good understanding of what is going to be successful for your team, and most importantly, how that aligns with what your mission is. And that's where the content from last week becomes so important. Even understanding what's possible. So if you haven't had the chance to go check out that recording, Matika dropped it into the chat already, but that's where you have the chance to understand what is possible and how those different possibilities will let you advance your mission and meet the different goals that you've aligned in like your strategic plan in some way. That gets us to the next step, which is having a really deep understanding of what the current state of your data actually looks like. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about some of the typical pain points that your teams might be experiencing and what that looks like from a data perspective. That gets you into the tools that you need to actually make the job happen. Same thing. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the different tools you need and why those are valuable, particularly through the lens of some really amazing resources at Microsoft. And then this back half of it, developing an implementation plan, building skills, and evaluating, we're going to talk a little bit less about those things today, but those are going to all be driven by what you're doing in the first few steps. Implementation plan is going to help you understand, based upon what you put in your data audit, or what you discovered in your data audit, rather. It's going to help you get to what does it need to look like. Skills is going to be focused around the people on your team and surrounding your team who are going to help actually make those things possible, both for implementation's sake and the long term, how do you make this feasible day in and day out? And that evaluation function is really important. That's how you understand, is this even working? Are we seeing the benefit that we've invested in over time? So all really, really important tasks. And of course, the other thing that we spent time on at the end of last week's session was getting a sense of what the data lifecycle is. And this is really the foundation of what we're talking about today. There are much more complicated versions of what a data lifecycle might look like, but at a really high level, it starts with how do you actually generate your data? Once you generate it, where do you store it and how do you get it there via extraction, transformation, and loading? And then ultimately, it's focused in on the analytics side of things as well. What are you actually doing with your data? And I'll call out, this is a somewhat simplified version of what this might look like. And there's some additional steps that you might think about too. It's like, how do you safely discard data when it makes sense to do that? But I think for today's purposes, these are a really valuable place to start. And of course, the other thing that we spent time last week thinking about was some of the different tools that you might use to do that. So last week, for example, we focused in on the Azure AI Foundry tool and how that enables doing even more complex things with artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence than what you might be able to do with just a Copilot license. We also spent some time talking about Fabric. We mostly talked about the predictive analytics capabilities of Fabric and how that enables analysts to be able to do their job more effectively. We're going to back into talking about Fabric again today, focusing more on the storage, the extraction, transforming, and loading capabilities of it as well. We didn't talk too much about Synapse last week, and that's going to come to the forefront today. Synapse is a differently powerful tool from Fabric that gives you a little bit more granular control. We'll talk about how later, but it covers similar steps in the pipeline. And the last piece that we're going to spend time talking about is Microsoft Purview, which is a data governance tool that lets you get a much better sense of where your data is inside of your Azure tenant, inside of your Microsoft environment, so that you can manage it really effectively. And we'll show you a demo of that as well. But in terms of actually talking about it, what we're going to do from here is step through each of those parts of the data lifecycle and talk about some of the considerations that you might think about making as you're thinking about building out your own data strategy. And so we'll start at the beginning. We'll start with actually the data generation component of this, because everything flows downhill from there. If you're not capturing your data appropriately and accurately, then you're going to have a bad time. It's the classic garbage in, garbage out type of scenario. So when I think about data generation, there's three major goals that I think about. And that's, I want to make sure that we're collecting data accurately, consistently, and in a timely fashion. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those things when we get to governance later on. But I think one of the places where I see nonprofits get in trouble with this is that very frequently there's a lot of manual data entry with limited validation put on top of it. And something that as you're thinking about building out a strategy for yourself is moving away from manual data entry and moving into more standardized collection methodologies that are automated so that you have less mistakes and you have better data flowing inside of your system. Trying to solve ahead of time. It's getting ahead of those garbage in, garbage out kind of problems. So just to give you an example, when last week we were talking, one of the examples we gave you was around this idea of could we predict donor churn? So if you recall, we were trying to answer the question of, is this person likely to donate again? So as a past donor, they've given money to us before, they've donated to our cause in some way. Can we figure out, are they going to donate? Yes or no? And we would assign that a likelihood. If you're recalling back to the different types of analytics opportunities we talked about, this is a classification model. So our output is going to be a number scaled between 0 and 100. And in this pretty simple example of that, the data that we had was coming from a whole bunch of different places. So past donation history was coming from Salesforce. Event attendance is something that was being entered in by volunteers from Microsoft Forms. We also had engagement with emails, and this might be familiar for some of you. You might be using a tool like HubSpot in order to track and understand things like click-through rates, open rates, all those different kinds of metrics for every single email you have. And you might also be storing income data. Like a lot of nonprofits augment their donor data with metadata about each of the donors, understanding how much income they have, their level of wealth, and there's a lot of different tools for that. And you might be storing something like that inside of Salesforce, for example. Now, in terms of data generation, one of the things you would be looking for is how do you make sure that the data gets into each of those systems in a very clean way, minimizing all the mistakes that you could possibly have. Later on, we'll spend a little time talking about some of the things you should be looking for from a data quality perspective and specific ways to solve it. But another question that you might be thinking of immediately is, okay, I have that data in these 4 different systems, well, really 3 different systems. What do I need to do in order to make sure that we get all of the data into the same place so that I can actually do the analysis with it that I'm looking for? We'll have a quick poll in a few minutes. I'm guessing that that's a problem that some of you have dealt with before. Your data is siloed, it lives in these different worlds, and they don't talk to each other. And so it's a really large amount of work for you to be able to go make the statement of like, hey, people who donated this amount of information in the past engaged with our emails in this way. Never mind combining 4 different data sets and then doing an analysis on top of it. And that really drives us to this next phase of the data lifecycle. The next phase is kind of broken up into 2 subphases. The first one is this idea of extracting, transforming, and loading your data. And then once you do that, how do you store your data? So we're going to talk about storage first, because that's a really important step in the process of organizations becoming more data mature. Where you store it really makes a big difference ultimately. And we'll come back to the ETL, the extract, transform, and load piece of it. When I think about data storage, I think about how do I make sure that the data in my organization is stored in a centralized system that's ultimately going to make my data more accessible and secure to the right people. So it's about giving the right people the right level of access that they need in a way that is repeatable for them to be able to do that. In a more traditional world, and some of you might still be doing this, you might have your files on-premises storage. So it lives on a server somewhere in your office. It's certainly less and less true today, but that could still be the case. So you might have certain files that are there. More and more frequently, what we see is people are moving to productivity suites, cloud-based storage platforms, things that look much more like Microsoft SharePoint and OneDrive and tools along those lines. So now your data does live in the cloud, but it still lives in a file storage system. When you're moving up the scale in terms of data maturity, one thing that you should be looking for is moving towards more cloud-based storage infrastructure, away from tools like SharePoint and into tools like Azure. And there's a few pain points that I think you've probably run into that might make you think about wanting to do things like this. So one of those is what I would call the lone system trap. And there's certainly a bunch more beyond the 3 I'm about to highlight. One of those problems that you might have run into is that someone on your team is the only person who has access to some really, really important data. And inevitably what's going to end up happening is that person is, going to go on and leave, whether it's for vacation or otherwise, and all of a sudden you can't actually get access to that data. No one on your team can get into it. You need it, of course, for the report that's coming up, and even as much planning as you did to try to avoid that eventuality, it didn't matter, and you still just don't quite have access to it. Or another one that you might really relate to, I hate this personally, it's one of my biggest pet peeves, is if you've ever had this situation of just 4 million very similarly named files, they've all been sent back and forth and like as email attachments, so you get report V1 updated and report really final 3, and no one actually really knows what the final one is. God forbid that there's like a set of initials on the end of it for someone who reviewed it, and that can be really hectic. Certainly, traditional storage platforms solve some of those problems, but it still leaves you in a pinch, and it can really be a problem. Or another thing that we see really frequently is you have some kind of automated reports. You've made steps in terms of that, so that you reduce the number of manual steps that you have to run into. But there's still a ton of steps you have to work through ultimately. And those require a lot of work. And so by the time you even finish doing it, someone's investing a ton of time into making that happen. And by the time you're done, the data is practically outdated as it is. I've felt those pain points in my own work. I'd imagine some of you feel some of those really deeply in yours. And there's some other really important names you might think about for these. These are the pain points we're looking out for. Here's 10 of them, and I'm going to talk through them a little bit more in terms of how you might see and feel them. And then I'm curious to get a quick poll after that in terms of which ones really resonate you, which are like the real big sticking points that are problematic. Two that we really look out for are these first couple, that there's no single source of truth. And that really gets to that kind of second pain point that we were talking about. No one's sure exactly what data is the real data. And so then when you have to go do reports or pull together whatever the information might be, whether you're writing a grant or writing a report on the grant or trying to make a decision about a program, you're just not actually sure, like how many people did we serve, in what place, how do you know that? These two numbers conflict with each other. Why do they conflict with each other? If that's a thing you're starting to run into, that's a really good sign that you need to move towards a more centralized data storage system. Or there's that other problem of the data silos, which I kind of outlined earlier. You have your data in 4 or 5 different systems, but they don't actually talk to each other. And so if you want to try to pull and make the relationship between your donor data and between your email data, you can't actually do it. There's no key that links those things with each other. There's no easy way for those tools to talk to each other. You might have also run into the version control issue. It's very related to the idea of single source of truth. And that's there, you do make changes to data over time. That's an okay thing. But if you're not able to track the provenance of the data, the versions of the data, you're going to get yourself into trouble pretty quickly. The limited data accessibility issue, also super common. That's this idea that we talked about a second ago of, hey, the right people on our team don't actually have access to this. We haven't really thought through what that should look like. And also, some people really should only have access to some of it, but not all of it. So it's actually just, it's not even about it being limited. It's just not right-sized in the first place. You might have challenges around that data lineage. So if you're getting audited and someone wants to see how those things changed, you don't have the ability to do that. Perhaps you've run into performance issues. I've seen this a lot of times. That this probably is true for someone here. Excel has become your database. And if any of us have spent enough time with Excel, you would know that while it is an amazing tool that basically props up most industry in some way, it's not performant when there's too much data on it at some point. You end up in a place, I don't know the exact number of records, but you get to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, or maybe really, really wide data. And all of a sudden, you can't really open up Excel anymore. You're going to have problems doing that. It takes a really long time to load. If you need to refresh the data on it, there are problems. And so that's a good sign that the tool's just not starting to work for your needs anymore. You might have governance problems. So governance being like, how do you actually care for and manage the data that you're working with? Do you know that it's going to be, do you know who's in charge of the data at any point in time? Who makes the final decisions on it? Do you know how it's getting updated? Do you know how quality is being taken care of for it? Are you thinking about your data, like do you have data inconsistency problems? That could be how you're entering it or any other number of things. Do you lack scalability? Do you lack automation? All really major problems that you could be running into that are a pretty good indicator for you that when you're thinking about a data strategy, you should be investing in a centralized data system to make your life easier. So let me put up a quick poll. I'm really curious to see for these 10 items, go ahead and select all that apply for your organization. I'll give you a couple minutes to go do this. You can join and fill out this Slido by going to slido.com or just going to this QR code, and there's this number to put in, 2377169, if you go virtually. And I'm curious, of these 10 that I just outlined, which of them are the big sticking points you're feeling in your organization? What are the pain points that are making it harder for you to do your work, harder for you to advance your mission in the way that you would really like to be able to advance your mission? Take a minute, curious to see where you all land in terms of this. Great, love seeing some folks starting to join and fill it out. I'm just going to give it a minute before I go ahead and reveal where people are starting to land, just so you can not be biased by how other people are feeling about it. And then we'll talk about it and what you're seeing and feeling. I'm curious to see which of these pain points are maybe the biggest for this crowd of folks. I have my suspicions. I'm curious if my suspicions are going to prove to be correct or not. So take another minute or so, and then I will show us what this team is starting to look like in terms of your pain points. Single source of truth, data silos, lack of version control, limited accessibility, no lineage or audit trails, poor performance, poor governance, data inconsistency, lack of scalability, lack of automation. What are you all feeling? Oh, interesting. Okay. I will be honest, that was not my guess. So there's certainly a long tail here, and you can keep filling this out if you haven't done so already. But interesting to see. So like lack of automation is a really big pain point for folks. And the good news is we are going to spend some time talking about that automation in just a few minutes. And Dharneesh is going to give you that great primer on Fabric and Synapse as part of that. But data inconsistency, like that can be a huge, huge problem for organizations. Some of you are feeling the data silos problem and this idea of poor governance. I'm actually surprised to see, like, not to say 57% is not a big number, but no single source of truth. I'm surprised that that is not a bigger problem. I would have guessed that would be much higher up there. And certainly long tail down. Interestingly, poor performance is just not really an issue that a lot of folks have, or limited data accessibility. At least, once again, 23% still a significant number, but certainly nowhere near 83% lack of automation. So we'll definitely talk about that. So one great step you can take in order to get yourself there, I already alluded to this, is I imagine a lot of folks have a lot of your systems, a lot of your data lives in places like SharePoint, or you're getting extracts of your data out of whatever other data systems you're using. You're going to download it as an Excel file or maybe a CSV file, and you're going to go dump it onto SharePoint, or you're going to go dump it into your local machine. Really, really common way to go about doing that, because those are the tools that you have available to you. And likely what's happening is as you do that, you're getting really frustrated by the fact that it takes a lot of time to go redo that work every month or however often you need the report that you need or the analysis that you need. And it's a huge pain point. And so a great first step to think about is moving from that cloud platform over into cloud storage and taking advantage of the tools that live as part of that environment. And in Microsoft, that's Azure. It's a phenomenal set of tools. Azure is a lot of different things, and we're going to only talk about a small portion of Azure's capabilities here. If you can dream it, you can probably do it. If you've ever had the chance to explore the Azure portal, there are just a lot of options that enable your work to happen at scale. And the benefit of this is you're starting to move to what we call the cloud. I feel very confident that everyone in this room this virtual room is familiar with what the cloud is. We're kind of taking advantage of it right now to do this call. The cloud, really, when everything is said and done, is just someone else's servers. They are servers managed by Microsoft, and obviously it's much more complicated than that in a data center somewhere. You typically are able to say which data center you want to use, or at least the region of the data center that you want to be able to use. And they come with some massive benefits that really, really help your teams do their work a lot more effectively. I'm going to list 4 of them out for you to start with. One that I think of that is really helpful is that it's much more reliable. So in a typical sense, like if you're thinking about more on-premise solutions, you need to manage that. And you might not actually have an IT person on your team who can manage those things. The benefit of moving to the cloud is that you now are offloading some of that work into people who are real professionals at making sure that your data is always going to be available to you at the moment you need it. Every single cloud provider makes guarantees about the uptime for their data so that you know that you're going to get access to it in the moments that you need. Another great thing, I imagine that every single one of your organizations wants to be able to grow their impact. And the beautiful thing about cloud is that it scales with you. As your impact scales, as the amount of data that you need to be able to do that scales, it's very easy to let the resources that you use on cloud grow with you at the exact same time, which makes you not have to, it lets you use your time in the way that makes the most sense to use it. The tools are really maintainable. They have kind of abstracted away some of the difficulties of working with and getting up and running all the different servers and things that you would need. Someone is just doing that for you. And it allows you to, once again, spend your time doing the work that you need. That's not to say that these tools are necessarily simple to use. They can be complex. There are a lot of options. You might need an expert to help guide you and make the right choices, but it really does simplify a lot of that decision space for you. And last, among many other different reasons to use it, these tools are really secure. They're tools that are designed to be accessible, but also only give access to the people that you need. If you're using Microsoft Azure and are already using Active Directory, it's tied into your Active Directory overall so that you can give permissions on a granular level for people to use the right resources that they need at the right time. And one really phenomenal thing to think about for us as nonprofit organizations is that Microsoft offers nonprofit credits. I believe it's $2,000 per year, and that offsets a significant number of the costs for your storage needs. And that's really, really valuable in order for you to be doing your work more effectively while taking advantage of these different resources at the same time. And if that's something that you're not taking advantage of today, even if you're using this, you should definitely find either us or reach out to someone at TechSoup, and we can make sure that you're getting those resources for you. So great, cloud is great. Highly recommend it. It is one of our first recommendations anytime someone is looking to build out a data strategy, is making sure we have an understanding of what cloud tools they're thinking about. But another thing that you should think about is just what type of data do you even have? And at a really high level, I think about data in 2 big buckets. I think about structured data, and I think about unstructured data, exceptionally creative names. Structured data is just tabular data. So any type of data that you can fit into some kind of table, wide, long, whatever shape it might be. But we can understand the structure of it from a rows, columns, and observations perspective. That's really valuable data. A lot of the data that we work with day in and day out, the reports that we build, come from data sources like that. But of course, you might also have unstructured data. In unstructured data, there's a much wider array of what that could look like. And oftentimes, it's some of the most valuable data that you actually have, even if you don't traditionally think about it as being data. That could be PDFs that your organization uses. That could be pictures. It could be emails. It could be videos, anything else like that. There is real data behind it, but you typically have to do work to get it from being unstructured data that's difficult to parse initially by a machine into becoming something that's more usable for analysis purposes. But it's exceptionally valuable. And the reason it's important to understand which of these you primarily have, and it might be a mix of the two, is because the way that you architect what your storage looks like is really deeply tied to the question of what type of data do you have in the first place. And I'll give you some examples of what that is. You don't have to perfectly remember all of these, but at a high level, I would think of these three major ways to structure data on the back end. One, you might have a data warehouse. Data warehouses are phenomenal for when you're pulling in a bunch of different structured data resources. So going back to the example that we gave about predicting donor churn, this would actually be the perfect use case for us to build a data warehouse. I'd be pulling my data in from Salesforce, from Microsoft Forms, from HubSpot, all landing them in the same spot so that I can go ahead and get them structured and cleaned and ready to go do the analytics that I want to do. On the other end of the spectrum, I might have a data lake. And data lakes are really great for dumping more raw, diverse data inside of, so that I can go do the analytics and go do the work that I need to afterwards. So if I have a lot of data that is more like PDFs and images and videos or whatever else it might be, a data lake might be a great place for me to land the data that I have. Or you might go with more of a lakehouse architecture, which is a combination of the two of those things. So that's a unified platform, and it includes elements of both of those different things. There are other types of architectures that exist out there as well, and you definitely shouldn't expect yourself to remember what all these different things are. But I think it is helpful for you to remember that based upon the type of data you have, you probably need to architect what your system looks like a little bit differently. If you're thinking about using Microsoft Fabric, data warehouses and data lakes are two options that are kind of available by default for you to be able to go work with, Lakehouse being really the primary driver of what you might be using there. And you'll see some of that when we switch over to Dharneesh giving a demo in just a little bit. So those are some of the things you might think about in terms of what the storage for your data looks like, which is going to be a really key element when you're going through that data strategy process. But that gets you to still the actual question of how do you get the data into the same place? And that leads us to this kind of sub-step on the data lifecycle, which is extracting, transforming, and loading your data. It's also worth calling out, sometimes there's another very similar process where it's a little flipped, extracting, loading, and transforming your data. You'll very frequently, and you don't need to get into the details of that, you just might see it written both ways. You also will very often hear it just referred to as ELT or ETL. Who wants to say words? We like letters, but that's what data engineers will very frequently call it. So it goes back to that question. I've got all these different data sources. I know the place I want to land it. I know the storage I want to make. It's going to be a data lake house, and I'm going to build that inside of Microsoft Fabric. But the question is, how do I even get the data there? And so in order to do that, we go through this extract, transform, and load process. We take data from the source that it's in, we get it out of that source, we transform it into the shape that we need it to be, and the shape that we need it to be to do the work we want to do. And then we load it into the storage that we've decided we want to load it into. And there's some key questions that I want to talk you through in terms of how to think about doing those things. And we'll start with the extract portion of it. When I'm thinking through this, there's more questions than this I'd want to think about, but here's 5 that resonate with me that our team really wants to hone in on. One, I want to spend some real time thinking about what actually are the data sources. I've already given you and told you what that looks like. That's Salesforce, Forms, and HubSpot. Something that's going to matter a lot, though, is really getting an understanding of how frequently does your data change. Sometimes your data changes a lot. It could change every second. You could get new queries coming in all the time. Sometimes it changes very rarely. And it's important to understand those things because that really will change how you think about setting up your ETL process. The data could come in different structures as well. So like we mentioned, there's this idea of structured data, but the way it starts could be a little bit different than that. We might need to think about what that is and how we need to handle it. That gets a little bit technical, but it's still a really valuable thing to think about. All the data sources have different ways to connect to the data. I need to understand what that's going to look like as well. Do I have to download it directly? Or maybe there's something like an API, an application programming interface, that allows me to talk to the data much more directly, and I can just pull it directly into the system. Or maybe there's some other interesting way that I have to get it. And also connected to that, how am I ultimately going to extract that data from however I'm connecting it? What needs to actually happen to make that occur? So here's how I might think about it for that donor churn data. Here's those 4 different data sources that we talked about. And like I mentioned, they actually all update at slightly different frequencies. We might expect the first few to update daily, though how frequently they update daily is an interesting question. So past donation history, well, we as an organization get new donations in every single day. Therefore, I'm going to have to, in order to make this donor churn model, I'm going to have to every day get the new information and make the appropriate transformation, whatever that's going to look like. We host events pretty frequently as well. Maybe those are happening typically once a week, but happening on different days during the week. So because of that, I actually might still need to update the data daily. I need to get the new event attendance information and land it into my data storage. We send out emails all the time as well. So once again, I'm going to need to extract that daily. However, our income data is something that we only update that about once a year. Every December, we go through and make those updates so that we have a decent sense of what the wealth of our donors looks like. So that really impacts how I might think about things. All that data comes in a different way as well. JSON is a pretty typical way that data could be extracted from systems. You don't need to know the details of it, but it's just a certain way that systems export data so that they can talk with each other. On the other hand, you might be more familiar with CSVs, or it could be an Excel file as well. Well, I'm going to make different decisions based upon what that data looks like. In a lot of cases, I'm looking for, and the best case scenario is that API exists. So Salesforce and HubSpot certainly have APIs. Forms doesn't have one in the exact same way, but I can still work with the data and get it out in the way that I want to. And there's a lot of different ways that I could extract it. There are tools like Azure Data Factory, or you'll see Synapse and Fabric momentarily, or I might need to build separate scripts with Python and do things in a different way. And I don't want to say that this is a perfect snapshot of exactly how you get all this out. I mostly just want you to think about the fact that there are differences between all the different systems and tools that I might use that are going to impact the choices I make in terms of getting the data that I need when I need it. So the next step I want to think about is how do I transform this data? Transformation is really where you start to get to the analytics of things. I want to think through the issues that might exist with the data in the first place, and this could be different for all the different systems that I have. I want to think through topics like outliers. What happens if there's a number that falls outside of the expected bounds? How should I handle something like that, and how do I get it into the system that I need? What about missing data? So what happens if someone didn't fill something out, or if a number is not there that I'm expecting should be there? Do I fill that in? Do I leave it as blank? Sometimes missing data means that it's actually equivalent to a 0. Sometimes it means that it's missing. And I have to know the difference between those things amongst a host of other types of problems that I might have to handle. That leads me to this idea of validation. Do I know that the source data was validated in the first place? And I keep teasing this idea, but that's, for example, if someone entered in the state that they live in, did I give them a drop-down field to pick from, or did they type it in? Because if they typed it in, they probably typed it in badly. Just, I'm coming from Delaware, so they might have written DE, they might have written Delaware, they might have forgot how to write words and written like Della. There could be a lot of variations, or it could be Philadelphia, Philly, Phil, all those different things. Did someone deal with that? Do I have to deal with that? Do I need the data to be aggregated in some way? So for example, if do I need to store the raw data from HubSpot, or can I aggregate it to calculate just click-through rate by day, by person? What does that look like? What are the things I need to do? So I need to augment additional data to it. So as an example of that, let's think about the donor data, the yearly income data. One, that's augmenting the data source in the first place, but maybe an additional thing that I want to augment the data from is census data about where the person lives. That could be really valuable for me. How do I need to do that? And the last thing I'm thinking about in transformation that I'm going to list here is how do I make sure that all these different data sources I'm pulling in can even talk to each other in the first place? So if I have HubSpot data and Salesforce data and event form or event attendance data, do I know that John Smith is always John Smith in every single one of those forms? What do I do if we just have name and there's two John Smiths? How do I make sure that those data sets talk to each other appropriately? I've got to go solve that problem so that ultimately when I load the data into the storage, I'm in a better place. And that gets us to these last sets of questions on load. Where should the data be stored? We just talked about what that might look like. Does it need to be organized for analytics work, for downstream work? What should that look like? How do I need to set it up? So I know how big of a data source I have. That's going to make me think about cost, first of all. It's also going to make me think about some of these choices. So how much, is it a really small amount of data? Or are we talking about millions upon millions of records, billions of records? How am I loading the data in? Does it make the most sense to just reload that data every single day? Or do I want to get the difference and append only new data to it? And also, I want to make sure that I have checks to make sure that we did this well. I want to check my work. I want the machine to check the work for me so that when it lands in the data, I can trust it. And I know that data quality is going to be as high as I can think of it as being. So all really important questions for us to think about. And then that gets us to this last piece, which is now that I've extracted, transformed, and loaded data, it's in storage, that brings us back to analytics. We talked, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this again, but from an analytics perspective, there's a lot of ways to do that you need to be thinking about ahead of time. AI Foundry was one of those tools that we talked about, but really I'm going to spend some time right now thinking about Fabric and thinking about Synapse. Fabric and Synapse, both of them, give you the opportunity to have your ETL and your storage in the same environment in a unified platform as your analytics. They just do that in slightly different ways, and both are great tools that could be worth investing in for you. Here's how I might think about the differences between them. I think of Azure Synapse as being a tool that's built for engineers to do their work a little bit more effectively, whereas Microsoft Fabric is a tool built for analysts to do their work more effectively. Synapse is going to give you a lot of fine-grained control because it's like designed for technical folks who know how to code, who can do all those types of things, and it lets you scale your data really effectively. It's just a much more advanced tool that you need more advanced knowledge to be able to use effectively. Fabric, on the other hand, is more of a low or no code tool. You'll see from Dharneesh when he does a demonstration of some of this, how some of that works, but it does still give you some of the control that you need to make more fine-grained adjustments. Ultimately, it's an easier tool to use that's more in line with self-service type of work for someone who, I don't want to say you're non-technical, but not as technical as an engineer. It has a lot of built-in options that are going to make your life a lot easier. The way I think about the trade-offs between those tool systems is that your productivity increases the more you go to Fabric because you can iterate on things quicker, because you're using more out-of-the-box types of things. On the other hand, as you move towards using Synapse, you gain more control at the cost of some of that quickness of iteration and the productivity that you get out of it. That's not to say that one is better than the other by any stretch of the imagination. They're just different ways to approach a problem based upon the needs that you have. To get a little bit better of an understanding of some of those things, I'm going to pass it over to Dharneesh at this point. And Dharneesh is going to take over and give you a quick demo of how you might approach some of the same problems. We actually did the same thing in both ways for both Azure Synapse and for Microsoft Fabric, specifically thinking about how to do extract, transform, and load. Dharneesh?
Thanks, Ryan. Just quickly checking in, is everyone able to see my Azure Synapse Analytics webpage?
You are good, Dharneesh.
So yeah, last week we looked at the ML capabilities of Fabric, and this week we are going to look at the Synapse and Fabric's data infrastructure side of things. So building on top of the example that Ryan was mentioning, let's imagine you are a fundraising manager, and every month you have been asked from your leadership team about like how much money did we raise and how campaigns are performing best, and all data analysis questions. So if you have a poor data infrastructure, you might run into the common challenges or pain points that we touched on. So things like different versions, mismatched column names, and so on. So now let's see like how these Microsoft tools, Synapse and Fabric, can help you build like a strong data infrastructure. So starting with Synapse, Synapse is a enterprise platform. So it uh, brings together the data warehousing and big analytics capabilities. So um, it allows you to run queries on both structured and unstructured data. And you can integrate data from multiple systems. You can work with your SQL queries, and you can write Spark. Spark is one of the uh, most used service for big data analytics. So it's much helpful in that case. And it provides a way to query and analyze your data at like a really large data volume. Like if you have like a petabyte scale of data, this is like the go-to tool. So to start with, I have like a few files, CSV files that have been like stored in an Azure cloud blob storage container. So campaigns, donation, donors, engagement events. So uh, common data types for like donations. So here is like the Synapse Analytics workspace. In the homepage, you could see like the ingest, explore and analyze, and visualize. So those are the three key functionalities. The first step is like we need to extract and ingest the data to the Synapse Analytics. Um, so one really cool thing about Synapse is that you can bring in data from multiple sources. So if your data is living in Amazon S3, or if your data is living in some of the other services in Azure, like SQL database and Dataverse and other things, you can pull those data much easier. So these are like some default connectors available in Synapse that you can make use of and create like a seamless connection to bring in the data and have like a single source of truth. So I'm gonna walk you through like some of the steps here. So the next is like after we ingest, we store the data. Um, so the data that I've showed in the Azure Blob Storage has been integrated as a data set in the Synapse workspace, and I have like all my 5 data sets here. The next piece is like developing a pipeline. We try to zoom in a bit. This is more on the transformations that Ryan was talking about. The converting the raw data into usable data is what all transformation is about, and we data engineers spend a lot of time in doing a bunch of transformations in order to make the data useful. So here is like a example where we can create a pipeline and do a bunch of transformations on the raw data. So we have the campaign data, the campaign source, and then we have the donation data. So I'm doing like a simple join between those, like a right join, and the Synapse gives you like all the mappings that you need, like what is your ID you are trying to join on, and it also gives you a preview of like the joined output results. And also, you can create your own expression. So Synapse has its own expression builder. If you want to create like a new column here, I'm creating like an age column with using some of the columns that the raw data has. So you can create your own expression builder here and add uh, new columns. And finally, like once we done with all the transformations, we can write it to a sink. So this is where we load the data, which can be fetched from Power BI for analytics purposes. So that's a quick overview of like the pipeline. Once we uh, develop the data flow, um, we can import the data flow in this pipeline, and then we can add triggers if you want to refresh the data in a daily basis or a monthly basis. You can uh, play around with the triggers. And it can also be integrated with other Azure services. So if you want to have the data flow into a function or some other services, that is also possible. And we can also monitor the results. So here is like a log of all the pipeline runs that I had. It has like a complete log of when it started and what duration it took, and all the things that you need to track to ensure the pipeline is not breaking and running successfully. And finally, you can manage the infrastructure side of things, like how much memory or how much size you want to use for the data based on the data size. Um, um, this helps with like the performance of the data pipelines. So yeah, that's a quick overview of the Synapse, and let's switch to the Fabric side of things. I'm gonna use the same set of files, and I have stored it in a SharePoint folder. Um, so yeah, in Fabric, uh, when you switch to Fabric, you can see that it's like more of a more user-friendly interface. It simplifies a lot of things, and it makes it much easier. Um, so here we have like a pipeline where we have the SharePoint. We are connecting the SharePoint, and we are doing some kind of transformations. We are loading it in the Lakehouse. Um, and the SQL Analytics endpoint is like auto-created. It can query from the Lakehouse. And finally, we have like a Power BI report. Power BI report has like a semantic model. So let's see how to do the transformation in the Fabric side. So Fabric uses like a Power Query to do the transformations. So here we have the files that are connected from SharePoint. I will walk you through like one of the examples here. Um, One nice thing about Power Query is like all the transformation steps that you do is kind of added as an applied step here. So you can go review and make changes and see the flow between all these. So the first thing is it's trying to navigate to the SharePoint folder, and it's trying to fetch the file that you need. Once it has the file, it's importing the CSV file, and uh, you could see the first row is the column header. So I'm just switching that to be the column headers. And one of the most common things that you do with raw data is like making sure the data types are right. So for all the columns, I'm making sure the types are matching the data. And you can do some transformations like here I'm doing like is direct donation. It's like a Boolean value. So I'm just replacing yes and no with true or false. Yep. So yeah, once we have all the process data, we can ingest this to the Lakehouse, and we can create like a semantic model so that it's like user-friendly for the Power BI report. I will switch to the semantic model. So this is um, the schema for the semantic model. So you could see like facts and dimension tables, and you could see the lines running. So it will show like one-to-many or many-to-one connections, and it's all connected with the date table. So this is now like the backend, the process data for the Power BI report. And the final piece of the data infrastructure is like visualizing the visualizing and doing analysis on the process data. So it seamlessly connects with Power BI. That's one of the big advantages of Fabric and Synapse. Both does a good job with the connections. So here's like a really simple dashboard. We have like some KPIs at the top, total donation, total donors, average gift, and things like that. And we have the year selection. You can slice the data based on the years that you would like to see. For now, I have selected like the last 5 years. Um, and Power BI has some cool features, like if you want to look at the Green Energy Fund campaigns data alone. So when you click on it, all the visuals interact with each other. So you could just view the campaigns data, all the KPIs and the donation graphs getting updated. Um, and And here's like another report where we have like all the donors and the total donation amounts that they have contributed. And we can have slices like preferred cause, and the data visualization capabilities of Power BI is endless. It's like it has supports so many visuals. You can create maps to see the donations by state, and multi-line chart and things like that. So yeah, so to summarize, um, both Fabric and Synapse are really nice tools. I like this analogy, like think of Synapse being like renting an empty apartment. You get walls, electricity, and things, but you need to bring in furniture, set up Wi-Fi, get TV, and organize your space. But Fabric is like uh, renting a fully furnished Airbnb. You have everything ready, and you can just walk in and use the furnitures and kitchen and all those things. So yeah, um, I will pass it over to Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks, Dharnesh. I really love that last analogy that you just used there. I think it's a really helpful way to think about the two tools. And another really helpful thing that you want to think about is for all those spaces, who's actually allowed in them and when, and how do you want to think about those things? And that really brings us to the idea of data governance overall. Data governance are the set of tools that help make sure that you're doing your work most effectively. I compared it earlier to like taking your daily vitamin and all of the different things that you want to do around that. It's the unsexy but super important stuff that's going to make sure that you're able to accomplish all of the goals that you want to as part of your data strategy. The mental model that I think about when I think about data governance is that everything we just talked about for the first portion of this webinar was data infrastructure. And our infrastructure tells us what systems we have, what data we're getting, all of those kinds of things. Ethics is what's going to tell us why. Why is all of that data important? Why are we doing the work that we do? Why are we thinking about all of these different things? Governance is the how. How do we go about making sure we're keeping our data secure, available, usable, with integrity, all of those kinds of things? It is the bridge between this infrastructure that you have, the what, and the ethics, the why. It tells you how to do all of those things. I really appreciate this definition of it. It is the strategic framework and oversight for managing data's availability, usability, integrity, and security within an organization by policy, standards, procedures, all of those different kinds of things. And there are a lot of different ways you might think about doing that. A lot of examples of what data governance could look like. It's everything from establishing data quality metrics in standards, to doing audits and assessments of your data, helping to develop a data quality plan to make sure that you know how you're making that happen. It's the monitoring and reporting on top of all of your data. It's understanding who is a steward of the data inside of your organization, whether that's one person or many different people. And it's making sure that you have all the training and awareness of data that you need in order for your team to be successful. It's important for a lot of different reasons. some of those big pain points that we talked about earlier, in fact. Data governance matters because it helps you get a better understanding of where your data is even coming from in the first place. So when you're looking at that final dashboard that you're delivering to your constituents or to a funder or whoever else it is, are you able to say with confidence exactly where the data point you're presenting actually came from and what happened to it along the way to make that possible? Do you have that type of trust in your data? So it's a tool to increase those things. Some of you, I'm not sure the different types of organizations that you have, but you might be dealing with some serious data privacy laws, particularly if you're in the healthcare space or maybe the education space. And even if there's not a law applicable to it, you have an ethical obligation to make sure that you're keeping the data of the people you serve safe, particularly in some uncertain times. It's a tool to, it's the process tool for how you remove data silos between departments at your organization so that your operations team is thinking about data in the same way that your programs team, in the same way that your development team is thinking about it. It's tools to make sure that you're using data the right way, that you're not misusing it, that someone isn't going to go look up the data for someone that you serve because they have a crush on them and want to go see where they live. And that is exceptionally not okay. And it's ultimately going to make it easier for you to use data for those analytics purposes. It's all, like I said, it's like taking your daily vitamin. It's something that's going to make you stronger and help you in the long run. I'm not going to talk about all of these right now, but I mentioned before that essentially like the precursor to how I think about data governance is really understanding the ethical implications that matter for your organization. I think a great exercise that you should think about doing at some point is taking a look. I'll briefly talk about different examples of these, but which of them apply to you and which of them don't? Every organization has a different mix of the ethical concerns that matter to them, and it just depends on who you are and what you serve and all those different kinds of things. I'm also going to call out that I don't think this list I'm presenting to you here is necessarily like a completely full list of every single ethical concern that you might run into, but it's a really, really good starting point. So a few that I think about a lot, I'm, like I said, not going to go through all 8 of them, but I'll talk through a few. One is like making sure that the data you're collecting in the first place is limited to specific purposes. And it's not something that you're just using for absolutely everything. And the people that you are collecting data from, or the organizations you're collecting data from, have consent, like you have gotten their consent in order to use that data. That's a really important thing. And it empowers people in a lot of ways to make sure that you're doing right by them. It ties into this idea of people should have ownership and sovereignty over their data. There are some laws that make that the case in some jurisdictions, where particularly if you're an organization of a certain size, you need to be thinking about those types of things. But that matters a lot, and people should have rights to be able to do what they want with their data or not have something done with their data. When you're doing analyses, you might be thinking about how to make sure you're being fair with your data. And even if you're doing all the right things, trying to be thoughtful in all the right ways, bias always creeps in. That could be bias from like you're not collecting data that you should be. So you're not capturing voices inside of data that you really should be thinking about. Or the flip side of that is that you might be accidentally causing harm by releasing certain data into the world. Sometimes you might want to think about like how open your data is and how transparent your data is. As an example of that, some of you might be or be interested in publishing dashboards about the work that you're doing, holding yourselves accountable to the constituents and the funders that you're serving. But by doing that, are you accidentally opening yourself up to not protecting data that you should be? That could be as simple as like, there's only one person who that data point could possibly represent, and so now someone could go figure it out. These are all really big questions that are really worth grappling with. And like I said, it's going to be different for every single one of your organizations, but you should take a moment to think about it. So that brings us to the governance piece of things. So like if those are the ethical concerns that we might have, the whys, now we get to the hows. How do we actually address those different types of issues? And there's a great set of questions that I would think about running through in order to get to that ultimately. There's 7 of them that when we're working with organizations to figure out what makes sense for them from a governance perspective that we run through. We've talked through a couple of these already, specifically those first 2, thinking about more of the infrastructure related types of questions. How does data flow through your organization? And how is your data collected and stored? That's a lot of what we talked about in the first half. But there's these other set of questions you might think about. How do you ensure that your data is high quality data? Who has access to your data? What security protocols are in place to protect it? How are you considering policies and regulations that could impact your data? And then how are you empowering and educating your employees and volunteers to use data effectively? We don't quite have the time and space to do the deep dive that every single one of these issues really deserves, but we're going to spend a few minutes talking through each one of those in turn, and then eventually wrap up with a quick demo of Microsoft Purview that Matt's going to give that helps address some of these issues for organizations. And we're going to start with thinking about high quality data. High quality data certainly starts at the infrastructure level. It starts at the source, making sure that when you're collecting or generating your data, that you're doing it in a way that's going to make sure you get the highest accuracy, most completeness, most consistent, most timely, and most reliable data that you possibly can. When I think about accurate data, I'm thinking about making sure that I'm removing as many errors as possible, that if I'm actually capturing donor contact information in the way that I want to. When I think about completeness, I'm making sure that I'm actually capturing it, that I'm not missing anything that I might want to get. Consistent data means that when I look at my data across the different systems, the provenance of it, that it is the same everywhere. That means that I've put in appropriate extract, transform, and load checks in place, and I'm doing all of those different things appropriately. I want to make sure that the people in my organization are getting data at the time that they need it in order to make the decisions that they need, and that it's getting updated regularly in a way to support that work. And that's going to change based upon what your needs are. And I want to make sure that whatever data I'm giving, probably because of all those other factors, is something that my team finds reliable, that it's going to be trusted for decision making. And that's particularly true when I can feel good about where I'm sourcing it from and how accurate that data is. There's a lot of different steps that you can take to do that. One immediate thing that I would want you to go step back and take a look at is just making sure that when on all the different systems that you're using, are you thinking about data validation in the right way? That's normally a trouble spot that I see when we're working with really any organization who's trying to get their hands wrapped around their data. Like, are you forcing something to be a number when it should be a number? Can they only pick date ranges that are logical and make sense? Are you forcing them to say, hey, yeah, it is Delaware, not DE? So you're giving choice where it makes sense to give choice and removing choice to create higher quality information where it makes sense to do that. And there's a lot of other simple steps that you can take now in order to make sure that you're getting that information for yourself. I think a lot about access and ownership types of issues. And this is a really important way to think about how to manage your data effectively. In a typical data governance system, there are really 3 levels of access and ownership that you might think about, 3 primary roles. I want to call out that depending on the size of your organization, this could actually all be the same person, but these are the types of things that you need to be thinking about. I want to identify for every single data set that I'm working with, who is the owner of that data set. This is the person who is accountable for it. They are going to make sure that we're classifying that data the right way. We're thinking about how to protect that data appropriately, and that we're thinking about quality of those data sets. A steward is going to be the subject matter expert who really, really deeply understands that data. They're going to work with the owner to set those governance standards for how to do things appropriately. And then the final role is someone who's more of a custodian, someone who's really doing the nuts and bolts changes. They're doing everything potentially from setting security controls to making sure that data gets into the right place, all of those types of things for the given data set. Like I said, in your organization, for whatever data set you're talking about, that might end up being the same person. But I think being able to identify, hey, our donor data is owned by this person. Colloquially, you might all know who that person is, but just being able to say, hey, because you own this, these are your responsibilities. This is what you should be thinking about. Makes a really big difference. Some of the reason that's important is because of these data security needs. There's a lot of reasons that security matters. None of us want to be the organization who had their data leak. But certainly beyond that, like you have some legal compliance issues that you potentially have to think through. You might have intellectual property that is tied into your data that you want to protect and make sure that you're taking ownership of. By having strong data security, it makes sure that you're building trust with your community. People know that when you take their data, you are being thoughtful about what it looks like and how you're storing it in a way that's meaningful. And last, it helps to make sure that you're preventing harm. The worst thing that could happen is that you have exceptionally sensitive data that could put someone's life at risk. Perhaps you're doing counseling. You've gotten some sensitive information about people, and now all of a sudden it's made public in a way that it shouldn't be. So being thoughtful about what that looks like, it's tied to your access controls, but there's a lot of other elements of data security you want to think about. Like I said, there's a lot of policies and regulations tied to some of these. Most of us are familiar with some of these different acronyms. These are all US-based things, but certainly if you're coming from another country, that could be true for you as well. Thinking of things like GDPR as an example. In the US, we have laws like HIPAA for health records, FERPA for student records, COPA for online child data. You might be getting credit card data and have to handle some of those things. You might be in California and have to deal with CCPA. Delaware, for example, also recently put into effect some data privacy regulations. So knowing what those are and knowing which one of those are going to impact you is going to matter really significantly. I can't comment on each of your own specific needs as an organization, but you should be able to know what those are and make adjustments as you need to accordingly. It's important as you're thinking about some of that, almost all of those policies and regulations refer to things like personal data and personally identifiable data. And so I think it's worth taking a second just to reflect on what some of those definitions are and give you some examples there, because those are things you're going to have to protect. They're not exactly the same, but there's some serious overlap between them. So for example, if I'm thinking about items that are both personal data and personally identifiable data, that might be something like someone who is named John Smith and you also have their social security number, 12345678890, right? Like having both of those things are immediately, they're both personally identifiable and PII. It could also be true if you have the name John Smith, like you have a list of patients at an HIV clinic and you see the name John Smith on there, that also could be personally identifiable information. It is certainly personal data. PII, examples of things that are personally identifiable but not personal data, are things like just a name. So if you're on LinkedIn and you see a person named John Smith, like, yes, that is personally identifiable. I could go figure out who that is, but that isn't personal data. It's not protected. Or similarly, maybe you're looking at public salary data, like for school teachers or folks who work in your local government. Oftentimes that information is posted. It's all publicly available because the idea is citizens should be able to see that information. So if I saw that John Smith made $75,000 a year as a local teacher, yes, that is personally identifiable. You could go figure out who John Smith is, but it's not personal data. It is public data. And some things are not PII or personal data. So if you just have age, zip code, and ethnicity, like typically that's not PII or personal, but you have to be careful with stuff like that. Sometimes there are so few people in a specific zip code, or whatever the geographical area is, or whatever the combination of things are, that if I have age and zip code and ethnicity, I can go figure out, oh, that is John Smith. John Smith is the only person who matches all of that criteria. And you could accidentally cause problems because of that. Or if you just saw the name John on that same list of patients for an HIV clinic. So being able to differentiate, like just because something is personally identifiable doesn't mean it's necessarily problematic. It has to be personal data. And that's something to look into and audit for yourselves. How are you doing as an organization in terms of protecting some of that very personal, very important data for people? And one of these last elements of governance that I want to go ahead and think about is how are you empowering your employees to make your lives easier? There are a lot of different ways to do this. One thing we're not going to talk about too much today is you should be empowering them via training. You should be doing what you can to make sure that everyone in your organization is data literate. They might not necessarily be the person working with data day in and day out, but they should be comfortable with data. It should be a conversation you're having, and you should be getting them the training to make sure that you're building that foundation for your organization. But you also want to empower them to be able to use data in your organization so that it's not stuck in the random SharePoint file that you're unsure of where it's coming from, but rather it's easy for them to find and use in the way that they need to. One really great way to do that is through data catalog systems. Microsoft Purview being one of those. I'm not going to talk through each of the elements you can see here, but the idea behind a data catalog is that it makes it much easier for people to lift and identify the data that they need in order to do their work and that they have access to. So it's kind of combining in that idea of those governance questions about owners and stewards and what people have access to with all the technical information that they need about it at the same time to do their work effectively. And with that being said, I want to pass this over to Matt. Matt's going to go through a quick demo of what you could expect from seeing from a tool like Microsoft Purview in terms of data governance. So Matt, I'm going to pass it to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. 1 second, let me take this over here. All right, can you guys see my screen okay? Yeah. Okay. So I'll try to go through this pretty quick because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions as well. So I think a little bit of Purview, kind of similar to Azure, in that or Fabric, that it's a really big service with a lot of stuff under the hood. Just looking at the landing page here, you can look at some of the stuff that Ryan has been talking about, the information protection, data loss prevention. I'm going to go through a quick demo that's going to show both kind of a surgical operation where you know exactly kind of what you're going for and you're trying to guide the rails of how you're going to manage it for data security. But then I'm going to try to kind of pull it back to a more general example that I think like all nonprofits or all organizations can kind of use just starting from point one. I kind of want to give that dual perspective. So when you log into the Purview portal, like I mentioned, there's tons of stuff that you can access, but kind of like Dharneesh was talking about how, when you're going through and you're modeling the data before you actually start using it, you can kind of do the same thing with Purview. The example that we have for this particular environment that I have was someone that was going through a giant merger. And so they knew that a lot of the information that was going to be specific to that was going to be super sensitive. So the operation that you go through with Purview, you can go through and you can define the sensitive information type. And you're kind of like building the pieces to be able to manage that process. You first have to build the criteria, the actual information type. I kind of like to point out this screen to show you that almost all of the things that are in here right now are in here by default. There is just a ton of security guardrails as far as like data classification that's built into Purview that you can use right from your get-go. Once you've kind of defined your sensitivity types, you can go through and start defining labels. When you start defining your labels, that's going to be more, to define whether it's going to like encrypt files or add content markings or control user access to specific sites. So you're going to start designing the how it's actually going to be used once that sensitivity is defined. So then you have to have a policy that's going to use those two things and put them into action. And you kind of combine all three of those things to determine exactly how the data for that sensitive process is going to be used. So I'm going to kind of jump over from that point. Once you have those kind of building blocks in place, you can run reports and start analyzing the data that is specific to that particular task. In this case, the merger that has super sensitive data. But even beyond that, I kind of wanted to show you just in general, also all the generalized security features that it's kind of able to collect at the same time. When we're at this dashboard, after we've configured those two options, you can then start seeing where those sensitivity labels are being used, how they're being used, and what types of stuff might need action. It's going to go through and you can kind of hover, like this is a demo environment. So like almost all of these things are going to be Office 365. But like as a good example, when you're talking about integrating multiple systems, if you have a CRM system and other systems that are integrated with this as well, that umbrella is going to cover a lot of things. And I'm going to kind of drill down so you can kind of see. Once you start looking at what it has actually detected, you can see it's going to start categorizing. Like there's our sensitive project, the Mark 8 projects. That's the demo example of the merger. But you can also see that it's identifying some of those default values that I talked about, credit card numbers, debit numbers. It's going through and looking at all of your resources and giving you a snapshot so that you can actually start looking at exactly how this stuff is controlled, limited, and actions that need to be taken based on the information. You can drill down even further. You can start going into each item separately, and it's going to populate the specific SharePoint site, the specific item. Once you have that, you can even drill down and it's going to give you a preview of some of these things. If I go to one of these sites, it's going to show me the specific items that are flagged for these types of sensitive items. Like these 2 items that it's showing me right here have full names in them, which again, as Ryan mentioned, that's, depending on how that's used and how it's categorized, that might just be standard PII data. But that's going to be where these like guardrails and these classifications are going to come into play. You can add secondary values. You can say if it's just a full name, it's going to have a certain categorization. But if it's a full name with other PII data, that might elevate it even more. And you're going to be able to see what people are doing, what actions to try to classify how that information should be governed and controlled. So it's super powerful with very little effort. And yeah, there you go. I think that's it.
Cool. Thanks so much, Matt. I'm going to jump in and take over again. But like we said, Purview is a super powerful tool, both for governance and for data discoverability types of purposes. And really, when I step back and think about it, like I've said a lot of times, governance is that vitamin that you take every day to make sure you're keeping data safe. But in general, like thinking about and making sure that the infrastructure that you have is going to support the data strategy that you want to build matters a lot. So we learned a few things today that I think are all really important. One, there are these tools like Fabric and Synapse that they really serve as that connective tissue. They're going to enable you to connect the infrastructure that you want to the analytics that you want to build, so that you can go meet your mission more effectively, so that you can have a successful data strategy that serves the communities that you're serving even more effectively than you already are today. But in order to do that, you need to have a great understanding of how to manage your data in a cloud-based system so that you can deal with some of those 10 pain points that we talked about. That could be data silos, that could be automating. That was clearly the top thing for a lot of you. That could be making sure you have high quality data in your system. All kinds of different pain points that all of you might be feeling in different ways. And last, that governance piece matters a lot. It doesn't matter if you build great systems if you don't have ways to maintain it and keep it secure and train the people around you in your organization to do that effectively as well. And for all of these, you can leverage tools to make that a little bit easier for you. All in all, thinking about the 2 sessions that we've run in the past couple of weeks, data strategies are a great way for you to think about how to optimize resources for your organization. Particularly in times that are challenging, being able to do more with less matters a lot. And so if you can use data as your tool to make that happen, that could be a really big win so that you could keep serving the communities that need to be served with potentially less resources than you had before in order to do it. They're also a great tool for you to build trust with your community, with your funders, with your board, with whoever else you might be thinking of as stakeholders in the work that you're doing. It's going to let you improve decision making. It's going to let you figure out where should you be investing in, where should you be putting resources, what programs are working and which are not, what should we pull back from, or which should we not be. And all of that is in service of your mission as a nonprofit organization. You have your goals, and data is going to let you do that even more effectively. And last, there are a lot of nonprofit or Microsoft tools that are going to enable you to do that more effectively. We talked through a bunch of them. Today we talked about Fabric and Synapse. Last week we talked about Azure AI Foundry. And of course we have Microsoft Purview as that governance model in the background. So we have about 5 minutes left, which is not a ton of time for questions, but happy to take any questions that you all have today, or about something from last week if you were here as well. Bailey also dropped the survey in, I saw, but happy to pause for questions at this point. I think you can potentially unmute yourself to ask the question. Not 100% sure about that, but chat is also always a great place to put it.
Yeah, if you would like to be unmuted, use the raise your hand option.
Thanks, Aretha. All right. Oh, what's the minimum size company that I need to worry about this? How do I measure this? That's a great question, actually. I don't know, Matt, Dharneesh, how would you two think about that? I could get my way to an answer, but curious if you all have an immediate thought.
I think for me, it has definitely depended on the content, like the data that you're actually dealing with. I've had some very, very small organizations that I've worked with that have extremely sensitive data. And so that conversation, that priority raises very quickly. Whereas there's some giant organizations that the data isn't quite as sensitive, but maybe they're just they really need to get some like lessons and information out of their data to help them with like funding and things like that. So yeah, it really just depends on the organization and the data a little bit.
Yeah, love that thought. We're really good at saying it depends. It's like two of my favorite words, but it is really true for a lot of this work. It does depend upon your specific context for sure. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, certainly, like, if something does pop up, you have our contact information here. You can see both for Microsoft Solutions, you can go to reach us at TechSoup.org, or if you have questions for our team at Tech Impact, certainly feel free to reach out to training@techimpact.org. I think those are both great resources. And just in general, on behalf of Tech Impact, big thank you to TechSoup and Microsoft